Lasting from 1789 to the late 1790s, the monumental French Revolution opened a modern era in politics and significantly changed French society. During this period, French citizens, such as myself, raised and redesigned our country's political landscape, uprooting centuries-old institutions such as absolute monarchy and the feudal system. The American Revolution and the Enlightenment undeniably fueled dissatisfaction with the old monarchy and sparked radical ideas and beliefs. The French Revolution originated in our government's financial difficulties, especially when Louis XV raised taxes to us members of the Third Estate, but not those of the nobility. At the start of the Revolution, we hoped to move away from the old regime, which was the estate system of the clergy, nobility, and the rest of us commoners, providing the foundations of society. Overall, the movement played a critical role by showing the world the power inherent in the will of the people.
Facing imminent bankruptcy, Louis XVI was forced to call the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. The Estates General was the legislative body of France representing all of the estates, but certainly not equally. The clergy and nobility occupied only 3% of the population, and 97% was the Third Estate, but we only had 1/3 of the deputies that they had. The first two estates could always outvote our Third Estate, and we called for a single assembly made up mostly of the Third Estate.
People felt it was very unfair for this Third Estate, which was most of the population, to only have 1/3 of the deputies. They felt it was very unfair that this should be a three-chamber parliament, where two chambers, the nobility and the clergy, could always outvote the common.
Advocate for the Third Estate, and someone who I found admirable, wrote in his pamphlet, "What is the Third Estate? Who, then, shall dare to say that the Third Estate has not within itself all that is necessary for the formation of a complete nation? It is the strong and robust man who has one arm still shackled. If the privileged order should be abolished, the nation would be nothing less, but something more. Therefore, what is the Third Estate? Everything, but in everything shackled and oppressed." On May 5, 1789, 1,200 delegates of the three estates gathered in Versailles, and we hoped for serious reform. Our representative, Maximilien Robespierre, was determined to make the clergy and nobility pay taxes. After a 6-week standoff, Louis felt threatened, and when we arrived on June 20th, we were found to be locked out from our hall, which angered me, and I also suspected that there was some sort of plot, but we still did not back down. We moved to an indoor tennis court where we all swore the tennis court oath, pledging not to disband until we had been recognized as a National Assembly and had written a new constitution. This was recognized to be the start of our revolution and was the start of the decreasing monarchical power.
Living in Paris, where work was unsteady and bread prices were high, background of poverty entered the people into a revolutionary stage. All we wanted were steady jobs and bread at fair prices. Other than poverty, we feared that the dismissal of Louis XVI's liberal finance minister would put us at mercy of the aristocratic landowners. When we were alarmed about the concentration of troops at Versailles, all members of the Third Estate, including myself, began to arm defense. I was ecstatic that I could play a part in obtaining social equality, something unheard of for members of the Third Estate. We needed weapons and therefore searched everywhere from public buildings to arsenals. On July 14th, we came to Bastille, a royal prison, and obtained weapons for the city's defense. Faced with popular violence, the finance minister withdrew troops in Paris. The National Assembly was now free to continue its work. Just as things seemed to be coming a little better for the Third Estate, more troubles arose when a bad harvest occurred. There was a grain shortage causing rural unrest in France. I can personally say that life was rough in the Third Estate, for I did not have the money to afford bread. Furthermore, grain supplies were now guarded by local militias as bands of vagrants roamed the countryside. Rumors spread among the peasantry that nobles had hired these vagrants to prey on villages and protect the new harvest from the peasants. I witnessed numerous commoners die due to starvation, unfortunately. On August 4, 1789, by a decree of the Assembly, all the old noble privileges, peasant serfdom where it still existed, exclusive hunting rights, fees for having legal cases judged in the Lord's Court, the right to make peasants work on the roads, and a host of other dues were abolished along with the tithes paid to the church. Steps towards social equality were being taken, and I could not have been more pleased.
To the peasantry, with the intentions to end the abuses of the old regime, the National Assembly moved on with its reforms. A revolutionary document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, was issued on August 27, 1789, based on some Enlightenment philosophers' writings, such as John Locke. It granted equality before law, representative government for a sovereign people, and individual freedom. Although this document was only 2 pages long, it had a profound effect all over the world. However, it had little effect on people like my family and I, the poor who were hungry and starving for bread in Paris, which furthered our despair and the catastrophic economic crisis going on at the time. Other important ideas of the Declaration include men are guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and due process before the law, taxes have to be paid according to the ability to pay, and the right to rule rests not only on the king but also on the general will of the people. The principles of the Declaration can be summed up with the phrase liberty, equality, fraternity, and that rapidly became the slogan of the revolution.
On April 20th, 1792, the Legislative Assembly, or France's governing body, declared war on Austria. The people of Paris saw the Declaration of Vilnius as a threat which led to the war. Revolutionaries wanted war because they thought war would unify the country and had a genuine desire to spread the ideas of the revolution to all of Europe. I helped hide food in the war, and my fellow commoners supported the effort in order to resist the return of the old regime. I was glad to take part in the war effort because things needed to change in France. The war went badly for the poorly equipped French soldiers. Also, the French army lacked organization and discipline, and many noble officers had immigrated. The allied Austrian and Prussian forces under Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, quickly crossed the frontier and began to march through Paris. He issued the Brunswick Manifesto, which was posted throughout newspapers. He stated, "If the royal family is harmed, I am taking out Paris." I was outraged because no foreigner should come in, take control, and issue such a statement.
Feeling that power was shifting to their side, the mob at the Bastille forced the imprisonment of Louis and his family. Louis attempted to escape in 1791, but was captured and returned to Paris. In 1792, the newly elected National Convention declared France a republic and brought Louis to trial for crimes against the people. The Girondists wanted to imprison the royal family and exile him after the European powers had been defeated. The Montagnards, the most radical group, however, wanted to execute him. On January 20th, 1793, the National Convention condemned Louis XVI to death, his execution scheduled for the next day. Accompanying Louis at his invitation was a priest, Henry Essex Edgeworth, an Englishman living in France. Edgeworth recorded the event and wrote, "The procession lasted almost 2 hours. The streets were lined with citizens, all armed, some with pikes and some with guns, and the carriage was surrounded by a body of troops, formed by the most desperate people of Paris. As another precaution, they had placed before the horses a number of drums, intended to drown any noise or murmur in favor of the king. But how could they be heard? Nobody appeared either at the doors or windows, and in the street nothing was to be seen but armed citizens all rushing towards the commission of a crime, which perhaps they detested in their hearts." Louis was executed by the guillotine, a new, more humane way to kill, but was still used too much during the Revolution, especially on members of the Third Estate. However, I felt that justice was served, as Louis was very oblivious to the hardships felt outside of court. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves throughout Europe. England, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and Prussia united in the first coalition to stop the spread of these revolutionary ideas.
By 1793, France faced even greater problems. Not only was the country at war with countries in opposition to the revolution, but rising prices, unemployment, and a rebellion in Vendée, the western part of France, led by royalists and priests, also threatened the government. In face of these growing problems, the Sans-Culottes joined with the Montagnards to oust the Girondists from the National Convention in May of 1793. These radical Jacobins centralized all control in a 12-man committee of public safety, which had dictatorial powers and, in my opinion, was not very safe at all. The goal of the committee was to save the revolution from foreign and domestic enemies. The committee subjected us to compulsory military service, and between August of 1793 and September of 1794, France raised an army of over 1.1 million men, the largest Europe had ever seen. To protect the revolution against the domestic enemies, the Committee of Public Safety instituted a reign of terror, lasting from the summer of 1793 to August of 1794, led by Robespierre. The reign of terror was awful for people of the Third Estate, and I was constantly in fear of being suspected for treason, even though I was doing no such thing. Over 400,000 people lost their lives to the guillotine during the reign of terror, and no less than 70% were people exactly the same as me. In late 1793, Robespierre proclaimed a Republic of Virtue. This was his bold scheme to de-Christianize France and to promote revolutionary values. He removed Christian symbols from public buildings, turned the Cathedral of Notre Dame into a temple of reason, and created a new non-Christian calendar. Part of me was happy that the clergy had less power due to this de-Christianization, and the church could no longer oppose the revolution.
When Robespierre was executed by the guillotine, the Thermidorian reaction began. The Thermidorian reaction was a reaction to violence of the Reign of Terror in 1794. Economic strains were removed, but inflation increased and bread riots occurred. Feeling betrayed, I dropped out of the revolution. As some people became wealthy through the revolution, I remained poor and dissatisfied. I despised the government and believed a new one needed to be created. As if my complaint was heard, in 1795, the National Convention chose a 5-member executive group that became known as the Directory. The Directory was the first formally constituted republic. The Directory gradually lost power when they were attacked by the aristocracy and the sans-culottes, groups critical of the government's economic policies. The Directory relied on support from the military in fear of a royalist uprising and the worsening of inflation. When a rebellion occurred in Paris on October 5, 1795, the Directory ordered a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, to crash it. He was successful in saving the Republic, but the savior would ultimately be the destroyer of the government. Napoleon was rewarded for his loyalty with the command of the French army fighting the Austrians in Italy. The Directory lasted 4 years, ending in 1799.
Napoleon Bonaparte learned that some prominent members of the legislature were plotting against the Directory. The plotters' dissatisfaction stemmed not so much from the Directors ruling dictatorially as from the fact that it was a weak dictatorship. I personally was still unsure if I wanted to go back to an absolute ruler, but many felt that 10 years of upheaval and uncertainty had made firm rule much more appealing than liberty and popular politics. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon and his conspirators ousted the Directors, and the following day the soldiers disbanded the legislature. Napoleon was named first consul of the Republic, and a new constitution cementing his position was overwhelmingly supported by a nationwide vote, which surprised me and made me feel like the revolution did not accomplish as much as we had hoped. Republican appearances of France were maintained, but Napoleon became the real ruler of France. In Napoleon's famous proclamation to the French people, he said, "On my return to Paris, I found division among all the authorities and agreement only on one truth, that the Constitution was half destroyed and could no longer save the liberty." This shows that Napoleon justifies his actions by saying that the Directory was weak and did not save liberty. I was hoping that with the inevitable taking over by Napoleon, that he could still extend and further some revolutionary ideas, including support of the poor and commoners. I hope that he would be a different kind of ruler than Louis XVI and not let the economy get into turmoil.
By 1799, a lot had changed in France. The 10 Years of Revolution abolished the monarchy as well as feudalism, where it still remained. Titles and privileges of the nobility, guilds, and manors existed no longer. The church had lost much of its power due to the actions of Robespierre, and its future position was yet to be determined. French citizens, including myself, had felt insecurity during the 10 Years of Revolution and endured violence quite often. Everyone had desires for peace and security, which I can personally agree with. The Third Estate, myself included, had only asked for social and economic equality. It was not fair that the clergy and nobility were exempt from taxes while the peasants were not. I could barely afford bread, let alone taxes. I am relieved reforms were made to create a better society and will forever change France.